Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And there's a very, very interesting development, and I want to thank Peter for sending me this link, and I'll actually link a PDF down below that you can download and read in your own time. It's a long PDF, but this subject is kind of aligned with that Sangoma who now works at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Remember that? Helping out the young students, Remember that story? Yeah. If you look at my old videos, you'll find it. What are we talking about here? This is a huge, huge, huge story. Decolonizing psychology in South Africa is a headline. And I'll put a link to this article for those of you who want to go and read it in time. But I want to put this on the record because it's in the American Psychological Association's website, and it talks about what they're going to, or they're planning to do, to the subject of psychology in South Africa to decolonize it. In the United States, one front of the battle for greater equality is the removal of Confederate flags, statues of Southern Civil War generals, and other relics of a hate-filled past. Efforts that have sparked protests and counter-protests in Charlottesville, Virginia, and beyond. But the United States isn't the only nation reckoning with a painful past. In South Africa, a protest centered on a statue of colonialist Cecil Rhodes on the University of Cape Town campus in 2015 helped launch a Rhodes Must Fall All movement that hopes to decolonize the country's higher education. In 2016, a Fees Must Fall movement calling for free higher education ushered in another wave of student protest. Well, nothing's changed. They're protesting all over the place, aren't they? Burning buildings down and the old cause and effect, guys. We talk about the L factor, missing in action, You just destroy the place where you're going to learn. Yeah, that's really going to help your education. Anyway. Although the statue of Rhodes is now gone, decolonization remains a prime topic of discussion and debate across disciplines. In psychology departments across South Africa, students and faculty are tackling the question of how to overcome psychology's past moral failings. Now, psychology it's a specialist subject. How could it have moral failings? Anyway, let's see what they say. Their goal: to ensure that the discipline is useful in a multicultural society still struggling with inequality, poverty, violence, and other ills, more than 2 decades after the end of the apartheid era, the period between 1948 and 1991, in which racial segregation and discrimination were official government policy. While the meaning of the term decolonization is still contested, a central focus is to dismantle vestiges of white supremacism. Santosh R. Pillay, a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and clinical psychologist at King Dinizulu Hospital Complex in Durban, said, "Psychology has a very dark history in South Africa. Hendrik Verwoerd, the chief architect of apartheid, was a psychologist himself. Now psychologists are working to develop a more relevant and contextualized psychology that can meet the needs of the majority of South Africa's population. These psychologists are changing the way they do psychological assessment, which was used to maintain white supremacy during the apartheid years and almost outlawed in employment contexts after the transition to democracy. They are examining how best to Africanize both the psychology curriculum and conceptions of mental illness and treatment. They're also using research methods that make science more relevant to the majority of South Africans." For South African psychologist Saith Cooper, PhD, president of the International Union of Psychological Science, removing the stain of colonialism and locating psychology within lived experiences are crucial next steps in the discipline's development. So, Psychology is now on the chopping blocks. They're going to change all the rules. I would love to get some comments from psychologists about this development. It's quite extraordinary. Anyway, let's continue. Sath Cooper, with a PhD, said, "The quest for a psychology that is reflective of and accessible to all of humanity should be a truly worthy endeavor that will strengthen our science and its numerous applications globally. The desire for psychology to be more reflexive, eschewing its traditional preoccupation with a limited Euro-American worldview, deserves our considered attention." Psychological assessment is an especially ripe area for decolonization, says Sumaya Laha, PhD, President of the Psychological Society of South Africa, and an Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of the Witwatersrand. Of all the areas in psychology, assessment probably has the most nefarious history, says Laha. Even prior to apartheid, it was used to justify oppression. The government used assessment tools designed for well-educated English-speaking white populations to demonstrate black South Africans' intellectual inferiority and aptitude for manual labor, says Laha. Now, I guess what he's talking about here is the IQ factor that we've talked about in the past. So I guess they're going to get rid of the IQ factor, seeing it as irrelevant in the whole subject of psychology. Let's see what they say. Following the country's first democratic elections in 1994, the government initially proposed outlawing employment-related psychometric testing outright, and subsequently required testing of employees to be valid, reliable, and unbiased. But, says Laha, even well-validated tests still don't work for the majority of the country, for whom English is a second language and whose education is minimal. There's also the issue of translation, given the nation's 11 official languages. Now, Laha and Witwatersrand psychology professor Kate Cockcraft, PhD, explained in a recent paper, South African psychologists are trying a new, more culturally sensitive approach as a way of decolonizing assessment. One strategy is to use more qualitative methods to supplement quantitative data, says Laha, with the focus shifting from test scores to narrative meaning making. These techniques, which are appropriate for low-resource settings, include inviting clients to create a story in a tray of sand or asking clients to create self-portraits within the outlines of their bodies, chalked on a playground or drawn on paper. Well, it sounds like the education equipment kind of fits, doesn't it? Anyway, let's continue. Training of psychology students also need decolonization, says Vabi Long, PhD, a senior lecturer in psychology and a clinical psychologist at the University of Cape Town. What students and some academics have taken issue with is the Eurocentric nature of academic knowledge, says Long. Psychological research is frequently autobiographical. Psychological researchers tend to do the kinds of research that resonate with them on a personal level, he says. So if we want African psychology to avoid the racially and culturally essentialistic cul-de-sacs of the last 2 or 3 decades, we need to do things differently. But there's debate about how to do things differently. For some, decolonizing the curriculum means Africanizing it. Foregrounding African epistemologies as a corrective against Eurocentrism's overemphasis on the individual and other problems. But such efforts have floundered, argues Long in a recent editorial. Africanization is frequently articulated in ways that are racially and culturally exclusionary, resonating with apartheid-era discourses of differences, he says. Africanization can also entrench essentialist ideas about Africans, says Long, arguing that it can fall into the trap of homogenizing diverse African thought into the paternalistic notion of an African worldview. What's needed instead, Long says, is training that acknowledges the appalling conditions in which too many South Africans live. He said, questions of class, inequality, poverty, and so on very seldom make it into the consulting room. In psychology, not just South African psychology, we tend to ignore questions of social context, economics, and structure, violence, and how they play out in people's psychological lives, and end up with interventions that are ill-suited for the problems people actually have in their lives. As his own effort to decolonize the curriculum, Long has introduced a seminar on critical psychology to expand future clinicians' scope of reference. Clinicians who are more attuned to the social determinants of psychological suffering can only make for better clinicians, he says. It is not necessary about getting clinicians to do things differently in the consulting room, but to think differently about human suffering. The language of training and practice is another problem, says psychologist Puleng Segalo, PhD, an associate professor and head of research and graduate studies in the College of Human Resources at the University of South Africa in Pretoria. Higher learning instruction is typically in English, yet many students have English as their third or even fourth language, he points out. Other students and clinicians don't speak the indigenous languages of the clients they're trying to serve. Well, that's the fault of the ANC government. There's no other country in the world where you don't have one major or two major languages that are understood by the general population. And those two languages are clearly English and Afrikaans. A huge percentage of the population right across the Calabar understand those languages. Now, they should be taught in all schools at all levels. But of course, this ANC government is trying to decolonize education. So I guess Afrikaans has gone out the window. I guess they're keeping English for the moment. But they've got 11 languages to play with. That's fun. Even basic conceptions of mental illness and how to treat it needs to change, says Segalo. Take the supposedly neutral diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Because of its individualistic focus, she argues, traditional psychology pathologizes those sufferings from trauma, situating the problem within the individual, rather than considering how trauma is also manifested in a family and community and how broader political, social, economic and historical forces contribute to suffering. This doesn't mean that South African practitioners need to toss out Western psychology altogether, says Segalo. The idea of decolonizing is that there is space for diversity, space for multiple ways of knowing. You know, this is what they're doing right across the education system. They're denigrating it. South African university degrees in years to come are just going to be a joke in other countries of the world. They will get you nothing if you leave South Africa. And clearly, it's so clear South Africa's moving back to the old dark ages. Anyway, let's continue. That could mean being open to doing therapy in new ways. For example, now, maybe they bring in the Sangoma. Remember the Sangomas who were saying that the students were upset and suffering because they didn't know if their fathers were the father that the mother gave them. There was a lot of confusion in their lives. And this was a huge psychological issue. So I guess the Sangoma should be the one who actually takes over psychology. What do you guys think? I'd love to see your comments down below. Let's continue. For many of the most vulnerable South Africans, she points out, the unfamiliar act of sitting in a room alone with a psychologist they don't know just doesn't work. But it's fine if it's a Sangoma or witch doctor. More effective options might include traditional healing circles, dances, drumming, and just engaging with others and with nature, she says. There we go. We got the Sangoma involved in psychology, the traditional subject of psychology. Isn't this exciting? You can't make this shit up. You really can't. You can't make this shit up. Anyway, she says traditional healers also have knowledge about how to deal with people who have experienced trauma. Other South African psychologists are trying to decolonize research methods. For Shozi Kesi, PhD, a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Cape Town, that has meant using a participatory action research tool called Photovoice to overcome what she calls the epistemological violence of traditional research methods. Sorry, guys. I nearly banged my head earlier, but this is a head-banging moment. Just get over it, okay? God love me. I think that's the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard in my life. It's right up there with this. When I was doing these, this is so off topic, but it just came to mind. They've probably got a psychological reason for that. But when I worked at Barclays Bank in the Copa, and I saw some of the most extraordinary names, because I was going through thousands of saving cards and fixing them up, and the most incredible name was Susie Matwetwe the second, and the second was not like, little two. It was actually written out the second. Now we have this. I've got to repeat this because it really is. This is how chaotic education is getting in South Africa. Other South African psychologists are trying to decolonize research methods. For Shosi Kesi, a PhD, a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Cape Town, that has meant using a participatory action research tool called Photovoice to overcome. Now this is it, guys. Just listen carefully. Listen carefully. Remember what Jacob Zuma said? Listen carefully. Okay. What she calls the epistemological violence of traditional research methods. Traditional research methods are violent. They're violent. They come and they attack you. Sorry. Let me get back to the story. I'm crying. It's just ridiculous. Okay. Sorry, guys. With Photovoice, a qualitative method developed in the 1990s, researchers give cameras to community members to document their lives, identify common challenges, and collaborate on solutions. The goals are to build consciousness and make participants agents of change in their own communities. It's a decolonial approach because it challenges traditional ways of doing research, where the researcher is looking for information that exists out there, says Kesi. Here we are saying, no, the knowledge is produced through the interaction in the community. Whoa! Now, that's really, I would love to get the comments by psychologists about some of these suggestions that are being made here. Just people who are not, a PhD in a university. Well, they can too. It's a free world. Just put your comments down below. Kesi has been using the approach with students and staff at her university, with much of the discussion focused on race. Most of the students talk about coming to the University of Cape Town as the first time they felt black, as they were being confronted by the whiteness of the institution. She says, noting that students often report that white peers undermine their work and won't even sit with them. For staff, the focus has been on denial of promotions and access to resources. Kessie now heads a transformation committee for the humanities division, while the transformation committees in each faculty weren't set up to address decolonization, says Kessie. Issues of decolonization are necessarily part of the discussions we're having. Now, for those of you who don't know, transformation is basically another word for black economic empowerment. What they're doing is they're kicking out all the white senior staff and bringing in black senior staff. So the institution is transformed. And of course, the incompetence of the people who've replaced very competent people reflects in the results. And that's what's happening in the education system right across the country in South Africa. And there's absolutely no doubt of that. Anyway, in conclusion, no matter what area of psychology, adds Pillay, discussions about decolonization are a crucial first step in ensuring the discipline's viability, as he argues in a recent editorial. Now, I'm going to link this article down below because it is quite extraordinary. I mean, you can't make this shit up. Seriously, you can't make this shit up. But it's actually been seriously discussed and worked on by these PhD students in South Africa. Quite extraordinary. Please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. And above all, please stay safe.